Detective Agatha Marple, Murder at the World's Fair. A Detective Tales, the Chicago World's Fair, a sprawling marvel of human ingenuity and ambition, pulsed with life. Steam wafted from the brightly painted food stalls, mingling with the rich aroma of roasted chestnuts and sizzling sausages. Children with wide-eyed wonder tugged at their parents' hands, balloons bobbing above their heads. The grand neoclassical architecture of the fairgrounds gleamed under the midday sun, every surface polished to perfection. Among the throng of visitors, a petite woman alighted from a horse-drawn cab. Clad in a sensible tweed coat and a modest cloche hat, Agatha Marple looked every bit the inconspicuous observer. She adjusted her hat and smoothed a wrinkle in her gloves, her keen eyes flicking over the bustling scene. She noted the details others might overlook: the tense set of a vendor's shoulders, the quick exchange of a small package between two men, the way a wealthy couple argued in hushed tones near the entrance. "Good day, ma'am." A cheerful attendant greeted her. "Welcome to the fair. May I assist you?" Agatha offered a warm, unassuming smile. "Thank you, young man. I'm here on behalf of the London Gazette. A journalist, you see. I'm particularly keen to report on the groundbreaking inventions being showcased." The attendant beamed, tipping his cap. "You're in for a treat, miss. The Innovation Pavilion is where all the excitement is. Dr. Thaddeus Finch is presenting something remarkable this afternoon." "Dr. Finch, you say?" Agatha's tone was casual, but her interest sharpened. "I've read much about him. A man of great talent by all accounts. And no small amount of controversy," the attendant added in a whisper, leaning closer as if imparting a secret. "They say his inventions could change the world or ruin his rivals." Agatha's lips twitched into a polite smile as she nodded her thanks and began weaving through the crowd, her purposeful stride belying her air of leisurely curiosity. The Innovation Pavilion loomed ahead, its gilded dome catching the sunlight. Inside, Agatha found herself surrounded by marvels of engineering, automatons performing mechanical dances, steam-powered contraptions chugging away, and a towering electric generator that hummed with energy. But it wasn't the machines that caught her attention, it was the people. Wealthy patrons mingled with inventors and financiers, their conversations brimming with veiled barbs and half-hidden ambitions. Agatha lingered near a display of intricate clockwork, her ears attuned to snippets of dialogue. "Finch is overreaching this time," muttered one man to his companion, his voice low but edged with disdain. "That machine of his is nothing more than a parlor trick. If it works, it will put the rest of us out of business," his companion replied grimly. Agatha noted their faces before moving on, her expression serene but her mind already cataloguing the information. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the way hands clenched nervously around champagne glasses, all of it painted a picture of tension beneath the fair's glittering surface. Near the center of the pavilion, a velvet rope cordoned off a raised platform draped in heavy fabric. A small plaque identified it as the exhibit of Dr. Thaddeus Finch. "How dramatic!" Agatha murmured under her breath, her dry wit soft enough not to draw attention. She lingered, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd for the man himself. Not far away, a figure emerged, commanding attention without uttering a word. Dr. Thaddeus Finch, tall and broad-shouldered, exuded an air of confidence bordering on arrogance. His voice carried across the room as he greeted patrons with an affable smile. But Agatha noticed the stiffness in his posture and the flicker of irritation when someone pressed him too hard about his work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch announced, stepping onto the platform today, "I unveil not just an invention, but a revolution, a marvel that will propel us into the future." The crowd leaned in, a collective breath held in anticipation. Agatha watched Finch's face as he gestured toward the veiled object, noting the pride in his expression and the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Fascinating," she murmured, tucking herself further into the crowd, her sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle she sensed lurking beneath the fair's dazzling surface. The Innovation Pavilion buzzed with anticipation, its gilded archways and gleaming marble floors lending an air of gravitas to the proceedings. A crowd had gathered in the center, their chatter weaving a tapestry of curiosity, skepticism, and awe. At the heart of the assembly stood a grand platform, draped in crimson velvet. Whatever lay beneath the heavy fabric was the cause of all this excitement or trepidation. Detective Agatha Marple, posing as a journalist, stood at the periphery, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She adjusted the ribbon of her modest hat, her fingers brushing against the notebook she carried for her supposed assignment. While others leaned forward in expectation, Agatha leaned back, content to watch the interplay of expressions and body language. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Thaddeus Finch emerged onto the platform, his tall, broad-shouldered frame cutting an impressive figure. His deep voice carried effortlessly, silencing the murmurs. Today you stand at the precipice of a new era, one that will transform industry, transportation, and perhaps the very nature of human endeavor. The steward stepped forward to adjust the microphone, but Finch waved him away with an air of practiced authority. Agatha noted the gleam in his eye, one that spoke of ambition, perhaps bordering on hubris. Finch gestured grandly toward the veiled object behind him. What lies beneath this cover, he continued, is the result of years of tireless work. It is no exaggeration to say that it will revolutionize the modern world. A polite smattering of applause followed his declaration, though not everyone appeared convinced. From her vantage point, Agatha caught a glimpse of Clara Linwood, a petite woman with an air of restrained impatience. Clara rolled her eyes, leaning toward a colleague. "Revolutionize the modern world," she muttered. "More like steal someone else's work and slap his name on it." Agatha's brow arched slightly, her attention lingering on Clara. Though Clara quickly resumed her polite demeanor, her earlier remark betrayed a deep-seated animosity toward Finch. To Clara's left stood Horace Bellamy, a man whose wealth practically oozed from his tailored suit and gold watch chain. His expression was unreadable, but he exchanged quiet words with an associate, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. Whatever Bellamy was discussing, it was unlikely to be complimentary. Toward the back of the crowd, Edward Carmichael, a thin, nervous financier, fidgeted incessantly with his pocket watch. He glanced repeatedly between Finch and the velvet-covered object, his unease palpable even from a distance. Finch, oblivious or indifferent to the undercurrents in the room, continued his speech. "This invention," he declared, "is not just a machine. It is a testament to the boundless potential of the human mind. It will reduce costs, increase efficiency, and pave the way for a brighter future." He pulled a corner of the velvet cover, offering the briefest glimpse of polished metal and intricate gears, before letting it fall back into place. The crowd leaned forward collectively, eager for more, but Finch's smirk suggested he had no intention of revealing his creation just yet. Agatha, meanwhile, focused on the crowd rather than the presentation. Each face told its own story: Clara's simmering resentment, Bellamy's calculating coolness, Carmichael's mounting tension. These, she knew, were the pieces of the puzzle that mattered. As the applause grew louder, Finch stepped down from the platform, his demeanor triumphant. He shook hands with a few patrons and exchanged pleasantries with Clara and Bellamy, though both interactions seemed strained. Agatha noted the stiffness of his smile when Clara's hand lingered a moment too long, her gaze challenging. A steward approached Finch with a sealed envelope. The moment Finch opened it, his expression darkened. His jaw tightened, and his hands crumpled the envelope slightly before shoving it into his pocket. Without explanation, he excused himself from the gathering and strode toward the pavilion's exit, his movements sharp and determined. Agatha's curiosity piqued. The contents of that letter, she thought, had clearly unsettled him. Her gaze followed Finch until he disappeared into the crowd. "Quite the showman," a voice beside her remarked. Agatha turned to see a portly man with a genial smile. "Dr. Finch, I mean. The way he speaks, you'd think he was unveiling the cure for mortality itself." "Indeed," Agatha replied with a faint smile, her tone mild, "though I dare say his audience is not entirely enthralled." The man chuckled. "You're not wrong. Between the rivals and the financiers, it's a veritable shark tank in here. Mark my words, Miss Marple," Agatha supplied. "Agatha Marple, Mr. Arthur Penrose," the man said, tipping his hat. "And let me tell you, Miss Marple, it's only a matter of time before one of those sharks decides to bite." Agatha allowed her smile to linger as Penrose moved on, his words echoing in her mind. Sharks indeed, she thought, but which one would strike first? The quiet hum of the Chicago World's Fair early in the morning stood in stark contrast to its usual lively bustle. Vendors prepared their wares, steam rising from food carts, and the occasional clatter of tools echoed through the grounds. But a chilling discovery shattered the calm. In the Innovation Pavilion, a fair steward stumbled backward from Dr. Thaddeus Finch's private pavilion, his face pale as a sheet. "Call the authorities," he stammered to a passing guard, his hands trembling. Inside the pavilion, Dr. Finch sat slumped at his desk, his usually proud form oddly lifeless. The air, heavy and unnaturally still, carried a faint, sickly sweet aroma of almonds. By the time Agatha Marple arrived, the pavilion had been cordoned off, but whispers already coursed through the fairgrounds. Murder? Suicide? Theories abounded among the murmuring clusters of onlookers. Agatha slipped through the crowd, her expression serene yet focused, her credentials as a journalist granting her a cursory nod from the guards. The scene before her was stark and troubling. Finch's body leaned forward, his face frozen in a grimace. A small, half-full glass rested on the desk, its contents betraying the faint almond odor that told its own grim story, cyanide poisoning. But Agatha's attention quickly shifted from the obvious to the overlooked. The missing letter. Agatha noted the clutter of papers strewn across the desk, but the envelope Finch had received the previous evening was conspicuously absent. Had it been taken by the killer, or was it destroyed? Disturbed personal effects. Drawers hung ajar, their contents in disarray. A fountain pen lay on the floor, and a sheet of crumpled paper had been discarded near Finch's chair. Someone, Agatha deduced, had been searching for something or ensuring something was missing. The invention, Finch's draped invention, now partially uncovered, caught her eye. Gleaming metal parts reflected the dim light, but Agatha noticed a gap where a critical component appeared to have been removed. "Interesting," she murmured, her gloved fingers brushing against a faint smear on the invention's edge. Grease, she realized, fresh enough to suggest tampering within the past few hours. The steward who had discovered the body hovered nearby, his face still ashen. Agatha approached him, her voice low and kind. "Mr. Harrington, isn't it?" she asked, gleaning his name from his uniform tag. The man blinked in surprise. "Yes, ma'am. You've had quite the shock, I imagine. But if I may ask, was anyone seen entering or leaving this pavilion early this morning?" Harrington shook his head. "Not that I saw, ma'am. Dr. Finch kept the pavilion locked at night. Only he had the key." Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "And you discovered him like this?" "Yes, ma'am. I came to deliver his breakfast as usual, but the door was ajar. I called out, but there was no answer, so I stepped inside. And the door, Agatha pressed gently. It wasn't forced. No, ma'am. It seemed unlocked. But that's strange, because Dr. Finch was always particular about keeping it locked, especially since he brought that machine in." Agatha offered a reassuring smile, though her thoughts churned. If the door hadn't been forced, then someone with a key or the means to obtain one had been here. The invention and the missing component. Agatha circled the invention, her sharp eyes noting the telltale signs of tampering. A missing cog, small but essential, had left the machine incomplete. The absence was deliberate, its removal served no purpose unless the culprit knew the machine's workings. As she examined the device, she heard the low hum of conversation among the gathered fair officials and stewards. "Who could have done it?" one whispered. "Plenty of enemies, I'd wager," another replied. "Did you hear Clara Linwood's outburst last week?" Called him a fraud to his face. Agatha stored the information for later. Rivals, financial backers, and disgruntled associates all could have reason to silence Finch. Theories begin to form. Before leaving the pavilion, Agatha cast a final glance around the scene. Her observations were forming a web of possibilities. The letter, its disappearance, hinted at blackmail or a warning. The disarray, someone had either searched for the letter or intended to make it seem as though Finch had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. The machine, whoever tampered with it, knew its significance, suggesting a personal or professional connection to Finch. She stepped outside, the murmur of the growing crowd brushing against her ears. Agatha's calm exterior belied the storm of deductions forming within her mind. The wheels were turning, and as always the key to solving the puzzle lay not in the overt but in the overlooked. The murmur of voices from the fairgrounds outside seemed distant within the Innovation Pavilion, where the air was thick with unease. The body of Dr. Finch had been respectfully covered, but the faint, sickly sweet scent of almonds still clung to the air. Agatha Marple stood near the crime scene, her gloved hands resting lightly on her notebook, her sharp eyes studying each person who ventured close. The steward, Mr. Harrington, fidgeted under her gentle gaze. His uniform, immaculate despite his shaken state, seemed to stiffen with every question she asked. "Mr. Harrington," Agatha began, her voice soft but insistent. You mentioned earlier that Dr. Finch kept his pavilion locked overnight. Was that usual for him? Harrington nodded quickly. Oh, yes, ma'am, very particular he was. No one in or out without his say-so. Yet this morning the door was ajar. He swallowed nervously. Yes, ma'am, strange that. He was the only one with the key well, aside from the master set the fair officials keep. But those are locked up tight. Agatha tilted her head, her expression unreadable. And did Dr. Finch have visitors? Late-night meetings, perhaps? Not that I know of, Harrington replied. He wasn't one for company. Always working, always tinkering with that contraption of his. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, not many liked him, if you catch my meaning. He rubbed people the wrong way. Agatha's eyes twinkled faintly. That much is becoming apparent, she said dryly. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. You've been most helpful. The arrival of Clara Linwood, a commotion at the pavilion's entrance, drew her attention. Clara Linwood, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly askew, had arrived. She pushed through the gathered fair officials with an air of both indignation and alarm. What's all this? She demanded, her voice sharp but wavering slightly. Her gaze fell on the covered form of Dr. Finch, and for a moment her expression softened. Good heavens, is he? Agatha stepped forward, her calm presence immediately cutting through Clara's agitation. Dr. Finch was found this morning, she said gently. I'm afraid he's passed. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, but Agatha noted how quickly her shock shifted to defensiveness. I had nothing to do with this, Clara said, almost before the question could be asked. I'm sure you didn't, Miss Linwood, Agatha replied smoothly. Still, you were one of the last people to see Dr. Finch yesterday. You must have spoken during his presentation. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. Not directly. I may have exchanged a few words, but nothing of importance. I left shortly after. I didn't even go near his pavilion after dinner. And where were you last night? Agatha asked, her tone light but her gaze unwavering. I was at the fair director's reception, Clara said quickly. There were dozens of people who could vouch for me. Of course, Agatha said with a small smile. And Dr. Finch's invention? Did you think it was as revolutionary as he claimed? Clara's lips tightened. Dr. Finch was ambitious. Too ambitious. I'll admit I didn't agree with his methods, but I would never. She stopped herself, shaking her head. I have nothing to gain from this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to gather myself. Agatha watched Clara retreat, her stride brisk but uneven. Interesting, she murmured. Not long after, Horace Bellamy appeared, his polished shoes clicking on the pavilion's marble floor. If he was shaken, he hid it well. Bellamy's manner was cool and composed as he greeted Agatha with a curt nod. A tragedy, he said flatly, glancing toward the covered body. Though I suppose it was inevitable. Agatha's brows lifted slightly. Inevitable, Mr. Bellamy? He smirked faintly. Oh, Finch had enemies. Anyone who pushes as hard as he did makes a few. But really, he was his own worst enemy. He had a way of turning allies into rivals and rivals into threats. And yet you funded his work, did you not? Agatha asked lightly. Bellamy shrugged. It's business, Miss? Marple, she supplied. Miss Marple, Bellamy continued smoothly. Finch had vision. He was a genius, yes, but geniuses are often difficult men. I respected his mind, not his manners. Did you speak with him last night? Bellamy hesitated just a fraction too long. I might have exchanged a word or two, but we weren't close. He kept to himself after dinner, and where were you after that? In the main pavilion, of course, Bellamy replied easily, mingling with the fair's more agreeable guests. Agatha gave him a polite nod. Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. I'm sure we'll speak again soon. As Bellamy left, Agatha turned her attention back to the pavilion. Already the puzzle was beginning to take shape. Clara's defensiveness, Bellamy's calculated detachment, and Finch's reclusive nature all hinted at secrets yet to be uncovered. Quite the collection of characters, she murmured to herself, her tone laced with dry humor. And I suspect I've only just begun to see their true faces. The engineering hall of the Chicago World's Fair was a cacophony of ingenuity and ambition. Machines hummed, gears turned, and the low thrum of electricity buzzed faintly in the air. Agatha Marple wandered through the vast space, her steps deliberate and unhurried. Her eyes moved from one mechanical marvel to the next, but her destination was clear, Clara Linwood's exhibit. The prototype machine Clara demonstrated sat on a raised dais, its polished steel gleaming under the electric chandeliers above. It was an intricate device, all knobs and levers, its purpose unclear to Agatha, but clearly the pride of its creator. Clara stood beside it, her shoulders tense and her hands gripping the edge of the table, with a force that turned her knuckles white. "Miss Linwood," Agatha greeted her, her tone as mild as ever. Clara glanced up sharply, her face a mask of forced calm. "Miss Marple," she replied, stepping aside as though presenting her machine to an audience. "Come to marvel at my life's work, have you?" Agatha's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's certainly impressive. I admit I'm not much of an engineer, but even I can see the artistry in its design." Clara relaxed slightly, though her hands remained on the table. "It's a model for an automated loom," she said, her tone regaining a touch of pride. "It's faster, more efficient, and less prone to errors than traditional machines. A leap forward in textile production if it's given the chance." Agatha stepped closer, tilting her head as if examining the device. "And yet," she said softly, "I imagine Dr. Finch's invention overshadowed yours yesterday. That must have been frustrating." Clara stiffened. "Frustrating. That man was a fraud," she said bitterly. "He plagiarized my earlier designs, passed them off as his own, and had the audacity to call it innovation. If anyone should be demonstrating here, it's me." Agatha met Clara's gaze, her expression sympathetic but probing. "And did you tell him that?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "Yes, I confronted him after his presentation. But I didn't." She cut herself off, her voice faltering. "You didn't what, Miss Linwood?" Clara looked away, her hands tightening on the table's edge. "I didn't do anything to him, if that's what you're implying. I told him what I thought of him, but I left it at that." I couldn't." Agatha noted the tremor in Clara's hands, the way her fingers tapped against the metal surface. Was it guilt, or merely the nerves of someone unjustly accused? "Miss Linwood," Agatha said gently, "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm merely trying to understand the events that led to Dr. Finch's unfortunate demise." Clara's eyes darted toward Agatha, her jaw tightening. "If you want to understand, start with his so-called invention," she said bitterly. "That machine of his was incomplete, a collection of stolen ideas, and he knew it. That's why he was so secretive, why he kept it hidden, even after his presentation." "And you believe his secrecy was out of fear of exposure?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Finch was desperate to maintain his reputation. And desperate men, they make enemies, Miss Marple." Agatha gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful. "Indeed they do." As Clara turned back to her exhibit, adjusting one of the levers with steady precision, Agatha stepped away. Her observations thus far painted a tangled picture: Clara's resentment, Finch's arrogance, and the mystery surrounding his machine. And yet, the deeper Agatha delved, the more the pieces refused to fit neatly together. The faint hum of the engineering hall filled the air as Agatha moved to her next lead, her mind already working through the implications of Clara's grievances. The manufacturer's pavilion was a shrine to progress, every corner gleaming with the marvels of industrial ingenuity. Agatha Marple moved through the towering displays of machinery and modern wonders, her pace measured, her eyes keen. The air buzzed with the clinking of metal and the hum of conversation. The one cluster of figures stood apart, commanding attention. At its center was Horace Bellamy, a man whose wealth and power seemed to radiate from his every gesture. His tailored suit fit him like armor, and the gold chain of his pocket watch gleamed as brightly as his well-polished shoes. He stood among a group of business associates, gesturing expansively toward a hulking piece of machinery behind him. "This, gentlemen," he proclaimed, his voice carrying over the din, "represents the future of industrial efficiency. Not some fanciful contraption built for applause, but a true workhorse of the modern age." Agatha stepped closer, her expression as neutral as ever. She waited for the conversation to ebb before making her presence known with a polite clearing of her throat. "Mr. Bellamy," she began, her tone light, "might I borrow a moment of your time?" Bellamy turned to her, his expression shifting from irritation to forced cordiality. "Ah, Miss Marple, wasn't it?" Agatha inclined her head. "Your memory serves you well." "What can I do for you, Miss Marple?" he asked, though his tone suggested his patience was limited. Agatha wasted no time. "I understand you were acquainted with Dr. Finch. His death has raised many questions, and I wondered if you might shed light on his work or his relationships." Bellamy's smile thinned. "Dr. Finch was a brilliant man in his way," he said, "but prone to flights of fancy. His invention, if you could call it that, was more showpiece than substance. A marvel for the eyes, perhaps, but hardly a revolution for industry. Yet you chose to fund him, Agatha pointed out gently. Bellamy's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Business is often a gamble, Miss Marple. Sometimes you wager on potential rather than proof. Finch talked a big game, but I had my doubts. Doubts strong enough to sever your partnership. His expression hardened. Let's just say I wasn't the only one questioning his integrity. Finch made enemies as easily as he made promises. As Bellamy spoke, Agatha's attention drifted to his assistant, a young man standing just behind his shoulder. The assistant, a wiry fellow with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, seemed intent on blending into the background. But at the mention of Finch's name, his hands twitched, and his eyes darted toward the machinery as though seeking refuge. Agatha, ever observant, turned her focus to him. "And you, sir," she said with a faint smile, "did you ever meet Dr. Finch?" The assistant's head snapped up, his face coloring slightly. "Me, ma'am? No, not directly. I mean, I saw him at the presentation, of course, but I never," he broke off, glancing at Bellamy for reassurance. Bellamy clapped the young man on the shoulder, his smile returning but now tinged with condescension. "Timothy here is a loyal worker, but hardly the social type. Leave the hobnobbing to men like me, Timothy." Timothy nodded quickly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Agatha let the moment linger, her sharp eyes taking in the interplay between employer and assistant. "Of course," she said finally, her tone smooth. "But sometimes it's those on the periphery who see the most." Bellamy's smile tightened. "Is there anything else, Miss Marple? I do have pressing matters to attend to." "Just one more question," Agatha said lightly. "Where were you last night after the dinner service?" "In the pavilion, discussing business with potential investors," Bellamy said without hesitation. "There are dozens of witnesses, if that's your concern." Agatha gave a small nod. "I'm sure you understand my curiosity. Dr. Finch's death has left quite the impression." Bellamy's gaze sharpened, but his tone remained cordial. "Yes, well, curiosity is a journalist's trade, isn't it? I hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Marple." As Agatha departed the manufacturer's pavilion, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Bellamy's confidence was palpable, but it veiled something darker, a dismissiveness that suggested he was more than capable of ruthless pragmatism. And his assistant, Timothy, though timid, might yet prove a valuable thread to tug. The rhythmic clatter of machinery filled the air as Agatha moved on, her thoughts already piecing together the puzzle. Bellamy had motives, certainly, but whether they aligned with murder remained to be seen. For now, her questions lingered in the air, unanswered but not unnoticed. The innovation pavilion, though quieter now, still pulsed faintly with the echoes of invention and intrigue. The hum of machinery had faded, leaving behind an eerie silence that wrapped around Agatha Marple like a shroud. She stood near Dr. Finch's private work area, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scattered remnants of his last hours. A steward approached hesitantly, clutching his cap in his hands. His uniform, though neat, bore the creases of a long day's work. He stopped a respectful distance from Agatha, his posture deferential but his expression clouded. "You must be Miss Marple," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They told me you were asking questions." Agatha gave him a kind smile, her hands resting lightly on her handbag. "And you must be Mr. Reynolds, the steward who attended Dr. Finch last night." Reynolds nodded. "Aye, ma'am. I was there at dinner. Served him his usual a light meal, nothing fancy. And just before dessert I saw him leave." "Leave?" Agatha echoed, tilting her head slightly. "And why would Dr. Finch leave in the middle of dinner?" Reynolds glanced around, as though ensuring their conversation remained private. "He was handed a letter, ma'am. A sealed envelope, brought by one of the fair's couriers. He didn't even finish his drink, just got up and walked out, looking mighty bothered." Agatha's brows lifted. "A sealed envelope, you say? And did you happen to notice who sent it?" Reynolds shook his head. "No, ma'am. But he clutched it tight, like it was something important. That's the last I saw of him till this morning." Agatha absorbed this information, her mind already spinning with possibilities. "And no sign of the letter now?" "No, ma'am." The fair staff searched his desk, his belongings. "Nothing. Just gone. A late-night witness." "Mr. Reynolds," Agatha said after a thoughtful pause, "did you see anyone near the pavilion last night? Anyone acting unusual?" Reynolds hesitated, his hand gripping the brim of his cap. "Well, ma'am, now that you mention it, I did see someone." Agatha's expression brightened slightly, though her tone remained calm. "And who might that have been?" Mr. Carmichael, Reynolds said, lowering his voice. "The financier. He was outside the pavilion, just past midnight, pacing like he had something heavy on his mind. I thought it odd, him being there so late. He looked like he was waiting for someone." Agatha's eyes narrowed, her mind already piecing together the implications. "Did he see you?" Reynolds shook his head. "Don't think so. He was too caught up in whatever was bothering him. He didn't even glance my way." "Interesting," Agatha murmured, more to herself than to Reynolds. As the steward excused himself, Agatha lingered near Finch's desk, her gloved fingers brushing lightly over its surface. The absence of the letter loomed large in her mind, its significance growing with every passing moment. Edward Carmichael, nervous, pacing and lingering near Finch's pavilion in the dead of night. A financier with ties to the victim, and a vested interest in keeping certain dealings quiet. And then there was the letter itself, a piece of the puzzle that seemed to evaporate before it could be examined. Agatha's lips curved into a faint, wry smile. "Secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight," she murmured. "And it seems this fair is brimming with them." The faint hum of the fairground machinery returned as Agatha stepped away, her thoughts sharp and her resolve firm. The missing letter was a thread worth pulling, and she had every intention of unraveling it. The executive lounge, perched above the bustling fairgrounds, exuded an air of exclusivity. Its polished wood paneling gleamed under soft lighting, and the faint murmur of conversation mingled with the distant hum of the fair below. Edward Carmichael stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the glittering spectacle. He was impeccably dressed, but there was a tautness to his posture, a strain that belied his composed exterior. Agatha Marple entered quietly, her sensible shoes making only the faintest sound against the carpet. She observed him for a moment, noting the tension in his shoulders and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against his palm. "Mr. Carmichael," she said gently, her voice breaking the stillness. He turned abruptly, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Agatha inclined her head. "Indeed. Forgive the intrusion, but I was hoping you might spare a moment to discuss Dr. Finch." At the mention of Finch's name, Carmichael's composure faltered. He hesitated, then gestured toward a chair. "I suppose I can manage a few minutes," he said, his tone forced. Agatha settled into the chair opposite him, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "I understand you were one of Dr. Finch's investors," she began, her tone conversational. Carmichael let out a short laugh, though it lacked humor. "That's one way to put it. Finch was persuasive. He promised the world with that machine of his." "And did he deliver?" Agatha asked lightly. Carmichael's jaw tightened. "Not yet. The machine was incomplete, little more than a prototype, but he insisted it would revolutionize industry, attract more backers, and eventually yield a significant return." "And you believed him?" For a moment, Carmichael said nothing. Then he leaned back, running a hand over his face. "I wanted to believe him. The potential was there, on paper at least, but it was a gamble, and as with all gambles, there's risk." Agatha's sharp eyes didn't miss the way his fingers fidgeted with his cufflink. "What kind of risk, Mr. Carmichael?" He hesitated, then sighed heavily. "If Finch failed to produce results, the financial consequences would be dire. Not just for me, but for others who trusted me to manage their investments." Agatha leaned forward slightly, her expression sympathetic but probing. "That must have been a heavy burden. Did you discuss your concerns with Dr. Finch?" Carmichael's gaze darted toward the window. "I tried," he said, his voice low. "But Finch was stubborn. He dismissed my concerns, assured me everything would work out. He had this maddening confidence, as if failure wasn't even a possibility. And yet," Agatha said softly, "failure seems to have loomed large, didn't it?" Carmichael's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "Only that desperation can lead to uncharacteristic actions," she replied evenly. For a moment, the air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Then Carmichael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "If you're suggesting I had something to do with Finch's death, you're mistaken. I may have had my differences with the man, but murder. That's absurd." Agatha remained seated, her expression calm. "Of course, Mr. Carmichael. I'm merely gathering information." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Well, if you must know, I was in my cabin most of the night reviewing documents. Ask anyone." Agatha rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carmichael. I hope your investments recover from this unfortunate situation." As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. His face was pale, his expression a mix of anger and something else, fear perhaps. Outside the lounge, Agatha paused by a grand vase of flowers, her mind churning. Carmichael's desperation was palpable, his financial entanglements with Finch undeniable. But was it enough to drive him to murder? She tucked the thought away, her step steady as she headed back into the fairgrounds. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Agatha adjusted her hat against the evening breeze, her keen eyes scanning the crowd. Somewhere among the flashing lights and excited chatter, the truth waited to be uncovered. The fair's records office was an unassuming building tucked behind the grander exhibits. Its modest facade belied the wealth of secrets it housed, stacks of papers, ledgers and correspondence that traced the intricate web of deals and ambitions underpinning the fair's glittering surface. Agatha Marple entered quietly, her sensible heels clicking against the tiled floor. The clerk behind the counter, a wiry man with pince-nez perched on his nose, looked up from his work with mild irritation. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his tone flat but polite. Agatha adjusted her gloves with deliberate calm. "I'm hoping to consult some files regarding Dr. Thaddeus Finch. He recently filed a patent, I believe." The clerk frowned. "We don't typically share patent records without proper authorization." Agatha's expression softened into what could only be described as maternal concern. "Oh, I completely understand. It's just that I'm a journalist investigating his tragic death, and it would be a great help to set the record straight about his work. One wouldn't want the wrong sort of story circulating, would one?" The clerk hesitated, then sighed. "Very well, ma'am," but only briefly. He disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a thick folder. "Here you are," he said, sliding it across the counter. Agatha nodded her thanks and carried the folder to a nearby table. Sitting under a pool of golden light, she began leafing through the documents with meticulous care. The patent filing was elaborate, detailing the intricacies of Finch's invention, a machine that promised to revolutionize transportation by harnessing a new form of energy. Yet, as Agatha compared the blueprints with earlier notes attached to the file, something caught her eye. Significant portions of the design were eerily similar to those in a submission by Clara Linwood from several years prior. The similarities were too pronounced to be coincidence. "Dear me," Agatha murmured, tapping her gloved finger against the paper. "It seems our Dr. Finch was rather less inventive than he claimed." The next discovery was even more damning. Among the correspondence was a series of letters between Finch and Horace Bellamy. Finch, it seemed, had been negotiating to sell the invention outright to Bellamy, bypassing any formal partnerships or credits owed to others. One letter, dated a week before Finch's death, read, "Dear Dr. Finch, your proposal is intriguing, but the sum you're requesting is steep. I'll need assurance that the designs are solely your own, free from entanglements. Otherwise, our deal is off." Agatha's lips thinned as she read. The implications were clear. Finch had been willing to betray his collaborators and likely had, judging by Bellamy's involvement. She carefully replaced the papers, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Clara's resentment, Bellamy's cold pragmatism, both motives were becoming sharper. Yet the question remained, who had acted on them? As she left the records office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fairgrounds, Agatha reflected on what she'd learned. Finch's death was not merely a crime of passion or desperation, it was a crime born of ambition, deception and betrayal. The pieces were beginning to form a clearer picture, though the frame was still incomplete. For every answer, a new question arose. What other secrets lay hidden among the fair's glittering facades? And how far would someone go to ensure those secrets stayed buried? Agatha pulled her shawl closer against the breeze, her keen eyes scanning the bustling crowd. Somewhere among the faces, the truth lingered, waiting for her to uncover it. Agatha Marple found Clara Linwood in the women's pavilion, standing before a grand display of mechanical models, her posture stiff and her face a storm of emotions. The elegant facade Clara had maintained since Finch's death now showed cracks, her usual composure replaced with an uneasy restlessness. Agatha approached quietly, her steps deliberate but unthreatening. Clara noticed her presence and turned, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped. "I assume this isn't a casual visit." "No, my dear," Agatha replied, her tone polite but firm. "I thought we might discuss Dr. Finch and the rather unfortunate revelations about his patent." Clara's hands tightened around the brim of her hat, but she held Agatha's gaze. "And what precisely do you think you've uncovered?" Agatha tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "The truth, of course. That portions of Dr. Finch's design were based heavily on your earlier work, and that he intended to sell the invention outright, bypassing your involvement entirely." Clara's face flushed, a mixture of anger and shame flickering across her features. She exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging. "So, you know." "I do," Agatha said softly, taking a step closer. "But what I don't know is what you did about it." Clara hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the clasp of her handbag. Finally she spoke, her voice low and trembling. "I confronted him, Miss Marple. I told him I knew what he was planning. I threatened to expose him, to ruin him. And I would have, too, if he hadn't backed down." "Would have?" Agatha repeated, her tone laced with curiosity. Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "But he was stubborn, arrogant. He laughed at me, said I couldn't prove anything. I wanted him ruined, Miss Marple, I did. But murder," she shook her head emphatically. "That's not my way." Agatha observed Clara closely, noting the sincerity in her trembling voice and the defiance in her eyes. "If not you, then who?" she asked gently. Clara hesitated, then leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Bellamy. He had far more to gain from Finch's death than I ever did. He was pressuring Finch to accept the deal, you know. Finch wasn't just selling the invention, he was selling out." "Selling out," Agatha echoed, her brows lifting. "To Bellamy's investors," Clara said bitterly. "Finch knew his machine wasn't complete, that it wouldn't work as promised. But Bellamy didn't care. He just wanted the patents, the rights, the prestige. Finch was supposed to finalize the sale this week. And yet," Agatha murmured, "the sale never happened." Clara's expression darkened. "No, because Finch is dead." The pavilion grew quieter as Clara fell silent, her anger giving way to a weary sadness. Agatha regarded her thoughtfully, piecing together the fragments of their conversation. Clara's bitterness toward Finch was evident, her motives clear. But the vehemence with which she deflected suspicion onto Bellamy was telling. "Thank you, Miss Linwood," Agatha said after a pause. "You've been most helpful." Clara straightened, her composure returning. "Just find the truth, Miss Marple, and let the blame lie where it belongs." Agatha nodded, though her thoughts remained clouded with questions. As she left the pavilion, she glanced back to see Clara staring out a window, her hands clasped tightly before her. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but as always, the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Agatha adjusted her hat and stepped back into the bustling fairgrounds, her mind racing with possibilities. The Innovation Pavilion was eerily silent, a stark contrast to its usual hum of activity. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, angular shadows across the room. Agatha Marple stepped inside with a purposeful air, her eyes scanning the space for signs of disturbance. Dr. Finch's invention loomed at the center of the room, its intricate mechanisms glinting faintly in the dim light. Agatha approached the machine, her gaze sharp and inquisitive. The polished brass components and complex gears were undoubtedly impressive, but there was something about the machine's current state that nagged at her. Reaching into her handbag, Agatha produced a small, folded photograph she had discreetly obtained from the fair's archive earlier that day. It was a snapshot of Dr. Finch during his grand presentation, standing proudly beside the fully assembled invention. She held it up, comparing the image to the machine before her. At first glance, the differences were subtle, so subtle, in fact, that most would have missed them entirely. But Agatha's keen eye caught the inconsistency immediately. The centerpiece of the machine, a gleaming cylindrical component adorned with intricate etchings, was no longer the same. In its place was a crude replica, its surface dull and unadorned. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line. The switch was undeniable. The real component, vital to the machine's functionality, had been removed. Leaning in closer, Agatha examined the surrounding area. The bolts securing the fake component were slightly misaligned, as though hastily fastened. A faint smudge of oil marked the edge of the machine, evidence of recent tampering. She glanced back at the photograph, noting the intricate etchings on the original component. The design was distinctive, likely unique. Whoever had stolen it knew its significance and its value. Agatha straightened, her thoughts racing. So Dr. Finch's invention was not merely incomplete, she murmured to herself. It was sabotaged. The implications were clear. The theft of the component not only discredited Finch, but also rendered his invention incapable of fulfilling its promises. This act of sabotage, combined with his sudden death, pointed to a calculated effort to ruin him entirely. But who stood to gain from such destruction? Agatha's mind turned to the key figures in Finch's orbit: Clara Linwood, whose own designs had been stolen and whose reputation Finch's success would overshadow; Horace Bellamy, whose financial interests in the invention were contingent on its success or failure if it meant eliminating competition; Edward Carmichael, whose desperation over Finch's risky financial scheme had been palpable. The theft of the component added a new layer to the mystery, one that tied directly to the motives of greed, ambition, and revenge. Agatha took a final sweep of the pavilion, her sharp gaze noting every detail. The faint scent of machine oil lingered in the air, a reminder of the hurried act of sabotage. Slipping the photograph back into her handbag, she adjusted her gloves and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fairgrounds. As the sounds of the bustling fair reached her ears once more, Agatha's mind was already piecing together the puzzle. The stolen component was the key to the case, and whoever had taken it was willing to kill to ensure its disappearance. With her usual quiet determination, Agatha set off to find the next clue, knowing that the truth was closer than ever, and that danger was likely not far behind. The din of the fairgrounds seemed a world away as Agatha Marple stepped into the small, stark office tucked behind the exhibition hall. A tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, as the train's conductor greeted her with a grim expression. "I thought you'd want to know immediately, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "We've arrested Miss Linwood. Found this among her things." From his pocket he produced a small glass vial, its contents faintly cloudy. Agatha didn't need to be told what it was. The faintly bitter smell of almonds, barely perceptible but unmistakable, lingered on the air. "Cyanide," she said softly, her gaze sharpening. The conductor nodded. "Matches the traces found in Dr. Finch's glass. It was tucked away in a box of her tools, clear as day." She's denying it, of course, but Agatha raised a hand to stop him, her expression unreadable. "May I see her?" Clara Linwood sat stiffly in the chair of the small holding room, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. The usual fire in her eyes had been replaced with something closer to desperation. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice shaking as Agatha entered. "You must believe me, I didn't do this." Agatha settled into the chair opposite her, her demeanor calm and measured. "You're quite certain?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Of course I'm certain. Someone planted that vial among my tools. I haven't touched cyanide in my life. Then why would someone go to the trouble of framing you?" Agatha's voice was gentle, but the question carried weight. Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "Because I had motive. Everyone knows I despised Finch for what he did to me. But hatred isn't the same as murder, Miss Marple. I may have wanted to ruin him, but killing him, that's not my way." Agatha regarded her thoughtfully, noting the earnest tremor in her voice, the indignation that seemed far too genuine to be feigned. "You're not a fool, Clara," she said at last, "and whoever planted that vial underestimated that fact. Tell me, where were you last night?" Clara recounted her evening in hurried tones. After dinner, she had returned to her pavilion to work on a demonstration model. She had stayed there until well past midnight, though no one had been around to see her. "I locked up and left," she said, her voice rising. "The tools were untouched when I did. Someone must have slipped in after." Agatha's mind ticked over the details. Clara's alibi, thin as it was, lacked the hallmarks of invention. But there was more. Something gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Back at Clara's pavilion, Agatha moved through the space with meticulous care. The vial had been placed almost too conveniently, nestled among tools where it would undoubtedly be found. But it was the box itself that caught her eye. The layer of dust on its lid had been disturbed unevenly, as if hurried hands had opened it recently. On closer inspection, faint smudges too large for Clara's delicate fingers lined the edges. Agatha straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Sloppy work," she murmured. Clara Linwood, for all her faults, had never struck Agatha as careless. Her tools were organized with precision, her workspace was a reflection of her methodical mind. The idea that she would leave a vial of poison, of all things, so obviously placed was laughable. No, This was the work of someone who wanted Clara removed from the picture. Someone who stood to gain from her disgrace or from the delay her arrest would create. Agatha's sharp eyes swept the room once more before she stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air. Clara was being framed, of that she was certain. But the question remained, by whom? And why? The truth, Agatha realized, was far closer than anyone imagined. She adjusted her hat and began to make her way toward the next piece of the puzzle, her mind alight with possibilities. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the fair's archive office, casting golden beams onto rows of neatly stacked papers and leather-bound ledgers. Agatha Marple sat at a mahogany desk, a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings spread before her. Her fingers moved deftly as she sifted through the records, her sharp eyes absorbing each detail with a quiet intensity. The name Dr. Thaddeus Finch appeared again and again, but not always in the glowing terms one might expect. Indeed, the further back she delved, the more tarnished his reputation became. One clipping, dated a decade earlier, caught her attention. The headline read, "Invention of the Century. Scientist faces fraud allegations." Agatha leaned forward, her lips moving as she read aloud. Dr. Finch claimed full credit for a mechanical design that, it seems, was developed in collaboration with a promising young inventor, Mr. Arthur Weston. She paused, her brow furrowing. Collaboration indeed. The article went on to detail how Finch had marketed the invention under his name, securing substantial financial backing while Weston, bereft of recognition or compensation, slipped into obscurity. The final line was especially telling. When asked for comment, Mr. Weston vowed he would see justice served, but he vanished from public view shortly thereafter. Agatha's thoughts turned inward. Weston's disappearance wasn't just a sad footnote, it felt deliberate. Finch's history painted a damning picture of a man whose ambition left a trail of bitterness in its wake. The people he wronged could fill a room, each one with a potential motive for revenge. Her mind flicked to Edward Carmichael, whose restless demeanor and furtive glances bespoke more than financial distress. Agatha recalled his tense response when she mentioned Finch earlier, the clenching of his jaw, the brief but unmistakable flash of anger. "What if?" she murmured, fingers drumming lightly on the desk. Carmichael's erratic behavior seemed less like guilt and more like the agitation of someone reliving an old wound. The archive steward, a bespectacled man with an air of quiet efficiency, approached, carrying another ledger. "This one might be of interest, madam," he said, placing it gently before her. Agatha offered a warm smile. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. Your assistance is invaluable." The ledger detailed patent filings at the fair. One entry, marked with Finch's signature, had a curious annotation in the margins, design adjusted per previous correspondence with E.C. Agatha's heart quickened. "E.C.," she whispered. "Edward Carmichael's initials." She closed the ledger with a soft thud and rose, smoothing her gloves. Her thoughts churned as she exited the archive, the fair's lively sounds gradually enveloping her. If Finch had leveraged Carmichael's work to secure his latest invention's acclaim, it could explain the financier's frayed nerves and animosity. Was Carmichael yet another victim in Finch's long history of betrayal? But one question nagged at her: had Carmichael's desperation driven him to murder, or was there still another hand guiding this web of deceit? Agatha's steps quickened. She needed to confront Carmichael again, but this time armed with the truth of Finch's unsavory past. The dim lighting of the World Antiquities exhibit hall lent an almost reverential air to the collection of relics displayed within. Artifacts from ancient civilizations were arranged with painstaking precision, their fragile surfaces catching the faint glow of overhead chandeliers. Agatha Marple moved quietly through the hall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished wood floor. Her target was Madame Isabelle Dubois's luggage, an ornate steamer trunk tucked behind a velvet curtain in the corner of the exhibit. Officially, it served as storage for personal effects while Madame Dubois curated her showcase of rare antiquities. Unofficially, it held secrets Agatha was determined to uncover. Agatha slipped on a pair of gloves and carefully examined the trunk. Its exterior was marked with gold filigree and initials embossed in dark leather. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, but a faint scuff on the side panel caught Agatha's attention. She pressed her fingertips against the spot, feeling the edge shift slightly. "Clever, but not clever enough," she murmured. The false panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a hidden compartment inside. Agatha's breath caught as she pulled out the contents. A small glass vial identical to the one found in Dr. Finch's pavilion. The faint scent of almonds lingered on its rim. A bundle of letters, each bearing the bold signature of Roland Vasseur, the infamous Parisian black market dealer. The correspondence detailed plans to transport a mysterious component to buyers overseas. A rolled-up blueprint of Finch's invention, complete with annotations indicating how the stolen part would fit into the machine. Agatha studied the blueprint, her mind racing. Dubois's motivations were becoming clearer. She hadn't intended to kill Finch, she wanted to dismantle his invention and profit from selling its stolen elements. But greed had a way of spiraling out of control. "Miss Marple," a voice said sharply from behind her. Agatha turned to see Madame Dubois standing in the doorway, her striking features hardened into a mask of icy composure. "You're a trespasser in my private domain," Dubois said, her tone clipped but steady. "Forgive me, madame," Agatha replied, her tone polite but firm. "But I couldn't ignore the troubling inconsistencies surrounding Dr. Finch's death. These," she gestured to the contents of the hidden compartment, "seemed to fill in some of the blanks." Dubois's eyes flicked to the items, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I won't deny my intentions to profit from Finch's work. He was a thief himself, you know. What I planned to do was no worse than what he had done to others." "But theft is not murder, you mean to say?" Agatha stepped closer, her gaze unrelenting. "Your actions, however, created the perfect storm of motive and opportunity for murder. Someone was always bound to take matters further, and you gave them every reason to act." Dubois's hands clenched at her sides. "I am not responsible for his death, Miss Marple. Finch was a man of many enemies. You've uncovered my greed, but I am no killer." Agatha observed Dubois carefully, noting the woman's rigid stance and tightly guarded expression. Her words carried the ring of truth, but there was no mistaking the ruthless pragmatism behind her actions. Whether Dubois had poisoned Finch or not, she had played a pivotal role in the events leading up to his death. "You may not have poured the poison into his glass, madame," Agatha said quietly, "but you set the wheels of this tragedy in motion. And that is something you'll have to answer for." Dubois said nothing, her icy facade cracking just slightly as she turned her gaze away. As Agatha left the exhibit hall, her thoughts churned. Dubois had motive and means but lacked the emotional drive for murder. The discovery of the blueprint and letters, however, pointed to a larger conspiracy. The question now was simple. Who else had been drawn into Dubois's web of greed, and who had been willing to kill to escape it? With her keen mind piecing together the fragments of deceit, Agatha knew the answers were close at hand. The stage was set for a dramatic revelation, and the players were already in their places. Would you like to move forward with the climactic gathering of suspects or delve further into the investigation? The grand pavilion of the Chicago World's Fair was a masterpiece of architecture, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across the polished marble floor. It was here that Agatha Marple gathered the suspects Madame Dubois, Edward Carmichael, Clara Linwood, and Horace Bellamy alongside a curious crowd of fair organizers and onlookers. Standing at the center of the room, Agatha's unassuming demeanor belied the sharpness in her eyes. With her hands clasped before her, she spoke in a calm yet commanding tone. "Dr. Finch's murder," she began, "was not the result of a singular act of hatred but a convergence of greed, desperation, and deception." She turned first to Madame Dubois. "You orchestrated the theft of the component from Dr. Finch's invention, intending to sell it through your contact, Roland Vasseur. This would not only discredit Finch but also ensure you profited handsomely from his downfall." Dubois stiffened but said nothing, her gloved hands tightening on the back of the chair before her. Agatha's gaze shifted to Edward Carmichael. "But the murder, Mr. Carmichael, was your doing. You poisoned Dr. Finch out of desperation, believing that Dubois's theft would deflect suspicion and ensure your financial ruin remained hidden." A murmur rippled through the room. Carmichael's face paled, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but Agatha raised a hand. "The poison used," she continued, "was traced to a vial found in Madame Dubois's possession. However, that vial was a decoy planted to frame her should the need arise. The true vial was in your possession, Mr. Carmichael, and the steward saw you lingering near Finch's pavilion late at night." Carmichael stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "I had no choice," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with both anger and despair. "Finch ruined me. That invention, he claimed it was revolutionary, but it was a sham. If it failed at the fair, my investors would have pulled out, and I'd have lost everything." Agatha nodded solemnly. "And so you sought to ensure he could not present it, eliminating both the man and the invention in one calculated move. You knew Dubois's theft would create confusion and obscure your role in the crime. Clara Linwood's public rivalry with Finch made her the perfect scapegoat." Clara, seated to one side, let out a sharp gasp. "You're saying he framed me? That he planted the poison among my things?" Agatha turned to her with a sympathetic look. "Precisely. It was no coincidence that you were arrested so quickly, Miss Linwood. Your feud with Finch was common knowledge, and Carmichael used it to his advantage." Carmichael slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he muttered. "I only wanted to save myself." Agatha's voice softened. "But desperation rarely leaves room for clean endings, Mr. Carmichael. In trying to save yourself, you condemned another and ruined countless lives in the process." As Carmichael and Dubois were led away by authorities, the crowd began to disperse, the fair's organizers murmuring about the scandal that would inevitably stain the event's reputation. Clara Linwood approached Agatha, her expression a mix of gratitude and bitterness. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "Though I can't say justice has left me feeling much better." Agatha gave her a small, understanding smile. "Justice often fails to feel just in its immediacy, my dear. But time has a way of softening even the hardest truths." With that, Clara departed, leaving Agatha alone in the pavilion. She wandered to a nearby window, gazing out at the fairgrounds below. The hustle and bustle of visitors continued as if nothing had happened, the grand spectacle marching on without pause. "Progress," she murmured to herself, watching a group of children marvel at a mechanical display. "It builds wonders and destroys lives with equal fervor, and we humans are so very skilled at using both for our own ends." Her reflections were interrupted by the distant chime of a clock. Agatha straightened, adjusted her hat, and stepped out into the fairgrounds, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Though this chapter had closed, she knew all too well that another mystery would soon call her name.